Touch me again, and you lose the right to call yourself her father.
This is your last warning, Ifeoma.
Your threats mean nothing to me, Han Jae-hyun.
Touch me again, and you lose the right to call yourself her father. These words escape Ifeoma's mouth like a final, desperate line of defense. She stands in the dimly lit hallway of Han Jae-hyun's private estate, her breath hitching as the man who paid for her best friend's education looms over her. The air is thick with the scent of expensive sandalwood and the metallic tang of rain clinging to his black silk shirt. Ifeoma is fully aware of the line being crossed, her focused eyes locked onto the man who has spent 2 years orchestrating her luck. From the shadows, Jae-hyun doesn't flinch. Instead, he steps into her space, his tall, physically commanding frame filling her vision. The intricate dragon tattoos crawling up his neck disappear into his sharp jawline, a silent reminder of the brutality he hides behind his refinement. For 2 years, Ifeoma believed she was building a life in Seoul on her own terms. She didn't know about the secret ledgers, or the iron boss watching her every move. The silence is finally broken by his voice, a low, dangerous rumble. I stopped being just her father the moment I saw you in that red dress, Ifeoma. Now, I am simply a man who has run out of patience. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ifeoma's studio, catching the dust motes dancing over her latest graphic design layouts. For the first time since moving to Seoul, the air felt light, free of the suffocating weight of her past in Atlanta. On her desk lay the signed contract of a lifetime lead creative role for a prestige brand that promised to put her name on digital billboards from Myeongdong to Gangnam. It was the kind of break that didn't just happen to outsiders. And yet, it had fallen into her lap with the grace of a miracle. She picked up her phone to call Suin, her thumb hovering over the screen. I actually did it, she whispered to the empty room, a triumphant smile tugging at her lips. She had come to Korea to escape the narrative that she was too much or damaged goods, and now, she was finally the architect of her own destiny. She felt regal, her posture straight, her mind already buzzing with the symmetrical, bold lines of the project. The celebratory mood shifted when a courier arrived an hour later, delivering a heavy, charcoal gray envelope embossed with a wax seal she didn't recognize. Inside wasn't a formal welcome from the board, but a private ledger of transactions and internal memos dating back 2 years. Ifeoma's heart began a slow, heavy thud against her ribs as she scanned the dates. The random scholarship she'd received her second semester, funded by a private shell company, the lucky opening for her current luxury apartment, orchestrated through real estate holding, even this current contract, the one that was supposed to be her crowning achievement, bore the faint, unmistakable scent of a setup. At the bottom of a confidential memo was a single signature in elegant, sharp calligraphy that made her blood run cold. Han Jae-hyun. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The independence she had worn like armor was a gift from the man who sat at the head of Soon's dinner table. She wasn't a self-made success. She was a masterpiece he had been carefully curating from the shadows. Her phone buzzed in her hand, a text from Soon flashing on the screen. Appa says he wants to celebrate your big news tonight. Private dinner at the estate at 8 o'clock. Wear that red dress I bought you. Please. It's a formal night. Ifeoma looked at the red silk hanging on her closet door, its fabric shimmering like a fresh wound. She thought back to the family dinner months ago, the way Jae-hyun's narrowed eyes had tracked her across the room, the way he had adjusted his watch with a predatory, controlled grace while she laughed. He hadn't just been watching her, he had been owning her before she ever knew his name. She felt a strange, twisted heat rise in her chest, a mix of incandescent fury and a dark, terrifying relief. She had spent a lifetime being undervalued, but Jae-hyun saw her value as something worth millions of won and years of meticulous planning. He was a man used to power, a man who lived outside the law, and he had turned his entire formidable focus onto a Nigerian girl from Atlanta. As she reached out to touch the red silk, her fingers trembled. She was stepping into a trap, one lined with gold and sandalwood, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure she wanted to escape. She was standing at the edge of something dangerous and transformative, and the man leaning over the edge was the only one who truly saw her. In the days that followed the revelation of the ledger, The air in Seoul seemed to thicken, turning heavy with the weight of a silent gaze Ifeoma could no longer ignore. She tried to bury herself in her work, retreating into the sharp, clean lines of her digital canvases. But the city she once found liberating now felt like a sprawling, glass and steel cage. Jae-hyun didn't call. He didn't send another charcoal gray envelope. Instead, he simply began to exist in the spaces she thought were hers alone. It started at the Kukya Gallery. Ifeoma had gone there seeking inspiration for a new brand identity, standing before a minimalist installation of light and shadow. She felt a familiar prickle at the base of her neck, a sudden surge of heat that had nothing to do with the climate control. Turning slightly, she saw him. He was standing 20 feet away, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like armor, speaking quietly to a museum curator who bowed with a deference that bordered on fear. Jae-hyun didn't look at the art. He didn't even look at her, but his presence was a physical pressure, a gravitational pull that made the air in the room feel thin. He moved with a controlled, assertive purpose. His dark hair swept back and clean, lines that suggested a man who never had to ask for permission. When he finally turned to leave, his narrow eyes caught hers for a fraction of a second, not a smile, but a calm, charged acknowledgement that made her pulse hammer against her ribs. 2 nights later, she was at a quiet, upscale bistro in Samcheong-dong with a few fellow designers. They were laughing over wine, discussing the vibrant energy of the city. When the atmosphere of the restaurant shifted, the owner personally hurried to the front, and moments later, Jae-hyun was seated at a corner table with 2 men who moved with the silent, lethal grace of his inner circle. He was positioned perfectly in her line of sight. Throughout the meal, he never approached her. He never sent a drink. He simply sat there, the dark, intricate tattoos on his hands shifting as he gripped a crystal glass. His concentration, fixed on her with a possessive intensity that felt like a hand resting firmly on her lower back. Ifeoma found herself losing the thread of the conversation, her laughter becoming a performative mask. She was fully aware of the line being crossed, the boundary between a chance encounter and a deliberate hunt. Everywhere she went, the shadows seemed to take his shape. When she stopped at her favorite coffee shop near her studio, she found her order had already been paid for by a gentleman who had just left. When she walked through the park at twilight, a black sedan with tinted windows followed at a distance of exactly 1 block, moving like a silent guardian or a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. It was a psychological game of cat and mouse, a slow burn corruption of her independence. He was making his presence felt without uttering a single word, weaving himself into the fabric of her daily life until the thought of him was as constant as her own breath. Ifeoma sat at her desk late that Friday, her fingers tracing the symmetrical cornrows pulled back from her face. She felt conflicted, drawn into the dark, intoxicating security he was offering, yet terrified of the price. Jae-hyun was a man used to power, now unsettled by wanting a woman he shouldn't, and he was teaching her that in his world, silence was the loudest confession of all. She was no longer just a designer in Seoul. She was a woman being marked. And as she looked out at the blurred city skyline, she realized the shadows were closing in. The Han family estate sat nestled in the hills of Seongbuk-dong, a fortress of glass, dark wood, and ancient stone that looked down upon the flickering lights of Seoul with cold indifference. As the heavy iron gates hummed open, Ifeoma felt a familiar tightening in her chest. She had dressed with the precision of a soldier preparing for battle, choosing a deep emerald silk gown that contrasted sharply against her rich, glowing skin. Her cornrows were tight and regal, her jaw set in a line of quiet strength. But inside, she was a house divided. Soon met her at the massive oak doors, her face bright with the innocent, bubbly energy that usually acted as Ifeoma's anchor. "You look stunning, Ifeoma. Like a literal queen," Soon chirped, linking her arm through Ifeoma's and pulling her toward the dining hall. "Appa has been in a mood all day business. You know, but he insisted on the good wine since it's just the 3 of us." The dining room was a cavern of understated wealth, scented with the sharp, clean fragrance of pine and expensive sandalwood. Jae-hyun was already there, standing by a sideboard with his back to them. He had discarded his suit jacket, his black silk shirt tucked into tailored trousers, the fabric straining slightly against his solid, muscular build. As they entered, he turned with a purpose that made the air in the room turn heavy. His dark hair was meticulously styled, but a few rebellious strands fell over his forehead, adding a rugged edge to his disciplined silhouette. "Ifeoma," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards beneath her feet. He didn't smile, but his eyes narrowed in that familiar concentration, tracking the movement of her parted lips before rising to lock onto her gaze. "Mr. Han," she replied, her voice steady despite the spark of electricity that jumped between them. The dinner was a masterclass in psychological torture. Suin sat between them, a bridge of light in a room filled with shadows, chattering about her gallery internship and her plans for the weekend. Ifeoma tried to focus on her friend, to be the person Suin deserved, but her every sense was tuned to the man at the head of the table. Jae-hyun ate with a slow, controlled grace, his movements deliberate. Every time his hand moved, the dark, intricate tattoos on his wrist peeking out from beneath his cuff. Ifeoma felt a phantom touch along her own skin. She watched the way he held his wine glass, the strength in his fingers, and felt the weight of her attraction like a physical sin. It was a heavy, inevitable pressure in her gut, a desire that felt like a betrayal of the girl sitting just inches away. "The new project," Jae-hyun said, his narrow eyes shifting from his daughter to Ifeoma. "I trust the transition has been seamless." Ifeoma's hand trembled slightly as she set down her fork. She knew what he was asking. He was asking if she had accepted the gilded cage he had built for her. He was asking if she was ready to stop pretending they were strangers. "It has been illuminating," Ifeoma answered, her gaze unwavering. "I'm learning that in Seoul, nothing is ever quite as it seems. Power has a way of hiding in plain sight." Suin laughed, oblivious to the subtext. "Oh, Appa is the king of that. He's so boringly corporate, but he makes it sound so mysterious." Jae-hyun's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his angular cheek. For a fleeting second, the mask of the refined businessman slipped, revealing the unsettled, possessive man beneath. He looked at Ifeoma not as his daughter's friend, but as a woman he intended to ruin for anyone else. The space between them, though separated by a table of fine china and silver, felt breath close. Ifeoma looked away first, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She watched Suin's animated face, the way she looked at her father with such pure and complicated love, and the guilt tasted like copper in Ifeoma's mouth. She was standing at the edge of a cliff, and the man holding her hand wasn't trying to pull her back, he was waiting for her to jump. As the evening wore on, the air became nearly unbreathable. Every accidental brush of a gaze, every shared silence while Suin laughed, was a fracture in the life Ifeoma had tried to build. She was a woman of discipline and self-respect, yet she found herself wanting to lean into the danger, to feel the heat of the fire Jae-hyun was stoking. By the time the coffee was served, the tension was no longer a secret. It was a living thing, a dark cord binding the three of them together in knot that Ifeoma feared only violence or a devastating betrayal could untie. The cool night air of Seoul usually felt like a sanctuary to Ifeoma, a sharp contrast to the suffocating luxury of the Han estate. But as she walked toward the subway station after the dinner, the city felt different, heavy, as if the shadows themselves were leaning in to listen to her heartbeat. She was blocks away from the main thoroughfare of Itaewon when the atmosphere shifted. The sound of heavy boots against pavement echoed behind her, rhythmic and persistent. Three men emerged from the mouth of a narrow alley, their silhouettes jagged and wrong. They weren't the polished executives Ifeoma saw in Gangnam. These were men who smelled of cheap cigarettes and old adrenaline. Their leader, a man with a jagged scar across his knuckles, stepped into her path, his eyes raking over her emerald dress with a slow, sickening greed. "You look lost, foreigner," he sneered in Korean, his voice a gravelly rasp. "A girl like you shouldn't be walking these streets without a leash." Ifeoma stood her ground, her regal posture unyielding. "Step aside," she said, her voice a low, steady chime of discipline. She felt the weight of her ancestors in her spine, a quiet strength that refused to be cowed. But as the other two moved to flank her, the realization of her vulnerability began to prickle like ice water. The man reached out, his hand closing around Ifeoma's upper arm, his grip bruisingly tight. Before she could scream, before she could even draw breath to strike, the world exploded into motion. A black sedan screeched to a halt at the curb, the sound of the tires like a dying animal's cry. The door flew open, and Han Jae-hyun stepped out. He didn't look like the refined businessman who had just sipped vintage wine. He looked like a god of war carved from shadow. He didn't waste time with words. Jae-hyun moved with a lethal, terrifying efficiency that Ifeoma had never seen. He caught the leader's wrist, and with a sickening crack, the man was on the ground. The other two lunged, but Jae-hyun was a blur of controlled violence. He moved with purpose, not haste. His solid build absorbing their blows as if they were nothing more than rain. Within seconds, the alley was silent, save for the ragged gasps of the three men crumpled on the asphalt. Jae-hyun didn't look at them. He turned to Ifeoma, his chest heaving, his dark hair disheveled. He reached out, his hands hovering over her shoulders as if afraid his own touch might be too much. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice a raw, jagged edge of its usual resonance. "I'm fine," she whispered, her voice trembling. Her gaze fell to his arms. In the scuffle, his black silk sleeves had been pushed back, revealing the full extent of what lay beneath. The intricate dragon tattoos she had seen peeking from his collar weren't just decorative. They were a map of a violent life. They spiraled down his forearms, dark and aggressive, ending in a mark on the back of his hand, a dragon, a eye that seemed to glare at the world. Ifeoma stepped back, her eyes wide. "Suin said you were in real estate. She said you were corporate." Jae-hyun's jaw tightened, the rugged stubble on his face catching the dim amber of the streetlights. He looked down at his own hands, then back at her. The mask was gone. The iron boss stood before her, and varnished and terrifying. "I am the foundation this city is built on," he said, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous rumble that always made her dizzy. "I own the dirt, Ifeoma, and I own the men who move it. Suin sees the man I wish I was. You see the man I am." He stepped closer, the minimal space between them crackling with the same heavy, inevitable tension from the dinner table. He didn't touch her, but his possessiveness was a physical weight. The people who did this, they didn't just see a woman. They saw someone I care about. They saw weakness. "Is that what I am to you?" Ifeoma asked, her chin lifting, her sharp cheekbones catching the light. "A weakness to be guarded." Jae-hyun narrowed his eyes, his gaze fixed on her lips, then her eyes. "You are the only thing in this city that I didn't plan for. And that makes you more dangerous than any rival syndicate." He reached out then, his thumb brushing her jawline with a surprising, rough gentleness. The dragon's eye on his hand was pressed against her skin, a brand of ownership and protection. Ifeoma felt the line being crossed, the boundary between the woman she was and the woman she would become if she stayed. She was standing at the edge of something transformative, looking into the eyes of a man who hid brutality behind refinement. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the monster. She was afraid of how much she wanted to stay in his shadow. The silence in Jae-hyun's private study was not empty. It was a pressurized chamber, heavy with the scent of rain, cedar, and the metallic tang of the violence he had just dispensed on the street. Ifeoma stood near the mahogany desk, her emerald dress a vibrant splash of color against the dark, masculine shadows of the room. She watched him move the way he discarded his blood-spattered silk shirt with a clinical detachment that terrified and mesmerized her. In the dim light, the dragon tattoos on his back seemed to breathe, an intricate map of a life lived in the dark, carved into the muscle of a man who had never known peace. He didn't look at her as he reached for a fresh shirt, his movements assertive but controlled. "You should be at home, Ifeoma," he said, his voice a low, jagged rumble that scraped against her nerves. "You should be scrubbing the memory of tonight off your skin and forgetting you ever saw the dragon's teeth." "I can't forget," she whispered, her voice a soft, regal chime that broke the tension of the room. She stepped into his space, the distance between them shrinking, until she could feel the heat radiating from his broad chest. "I've spent my whole life being told what I should be. I came to Seoul to be my own architect, Jae-hyun. But how can I build anything when you've already bought the foundation?" Jae-hyun froze, his hands stilled against the buttons of his shirt. He turned slowly, his angular face caught in the amber glow of a single desk lamp. His eyes were narrowed, fixed on her with an intensity that signaled obsession rather than casual desire. He looked at her sharp cheekbones, her full lips, and the neat, symmetrical cornrows that symbolized the discipline he was about to help her shatter. "I didn't buy you, Ifeoma," he said, stepping so close that their breath mingled. "I protected you." "There is a difference." "Is there?" she challenged, her chin lifting. Or am I just another territory for the Iron Boss to claim? The air between them ignited. Jae-hyun's hand moved with a purpose that lacked haste, his thumb brushing her lower lip with a rough gentleness. His touch was a brand, a silent acknowledgement, that the line had not just been reached, it had been obliterated. I've spent 127 days trying to convince myself that you were just Suin's friend, he confessed, his voice dropping to an intimate, devastating pitch. I've tried to be the man she thinks I am, but I am tired of restraint. I am a man who gets what he wants, and God help me, I have wanted you since the second you walked into that red light. Ifeoma didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her eyes locked onto his. She was fully aware of the betrayal this represented, the sin she was committing against Suin, but her desire was a physical weight that had become impossible to carry. Then stop talking, she breathed. The surrender was not weak. It was a mutual pull, a heavy and inevitable collision. When his mouth finally met hers, it wasn't the tentative kiss of a suitor, but the claim of a king. It tasted of whiskey, sign, and the dark promises of a man who lived outside the law. Jae-hyun's hands were possessive, one fisting in the silk of her dress, the other supporting the small of her back as he pulled her flush against the solid, muscular planes of his body. Ifeoma felt herself dissolving into him, her fingers tracing the ink on his arms, memorizing the texture of the dragon's scales. This wasn't a playful romance. It was transformative and dangerous. As they moved toward the reclining leather chair, the blurred city skyline of Seoul watched from afar, a silent witness to a private war being won. In the heat of his embrace, Ifeoma realized there was no turning back to the girl who had arrived from Atlanta with simple dreams. She was crossing the Rubicon, leaving the safety of the shore for the deep, dark currents of Jae-hyun's world. As the clothes fell away, revealing the rich, glowing brown of her skin against the pale, scarred canvas of his, the stakes finally crystallized. This love carried consequences that would burn. But as Jae-hyun leaned over her, his eyes narrowed in absolute concentration. Ifeoma knew she would rather burn in his fire than freeze in a world where he didn't exist. The Iron Boss had been unsettled by her, but in the quiet of the study, she realized she held a power over him that no rival syndicate could match. She was his weakness, and he was her ruin. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our dramatic love stories. Comment below and let's continue with this journey. The night air outside remained cold, but inside, the atmosphere was a fever. As they gave in to the 4 months of suppressed want, the first fracture in their lives became a canyon. They were no longer the Mafia boss and his daughter's best friend. They were two souls standing at the edge of a beautiful, violent catastrophe, and as Ifeoma gasped his name into the silence, she knew she was finally home. The afterglow of their union was a fragile glass shell, and it shattered before the sun could even grace the Seoul skyline. Ifeoma was draped in one of Jae-hyun's black silk robes, the hem pooling around her ankles like liquid shadow. When the rhythmic peace of his penthouse was pierced by the frantic chime of a secure line, Jae-hyun didn't hesitate. He shifted from the man who had just held her with surprising reverence back into the architect in a single heartbeat. His angular face went cold, the rugged shadow on his jaw catching the dim light as he listened to the voice. On the other end, he didn't speak. He simply tightened his grip on the phone until his knuckles turned white, the dragon's eye on his hand seemingly glaring in anticipation. "The White Tigers," he said, his voice no longer a low rumble but a flat, lethal blade. "They found the warehouse in Incheon. They think they can bleed me by taking what I've built." Jae-hyun. Ifeoma stepped toward him, her rich brown skin glowing softly against the dark silk, her eyes searching his for the man she had seen an hour ago. "Stay here," he commanded. It wasn't a request. It was the assertive, controlled authority of a man used to power. He was already dressing, pulling on a clean, black shirt and a tailored jacket that hid the intricate tattoos but couldn't mask the menace radiating from his solid frame. "The elevator is locked to your biometric signature. No one gets in. Do not look out the windows." But Ifeoma was not a woman of passive surrender. As soon as the private elevator hummed into the depths of the building, she moved to the reinforced glass, her heart hammering against her ribs. Below, the blurred city skyline was a chaotic tapestry of red and blue strobes. A convoy of black sedans was screaming away from the curb, but they weren't fast enough. From the shadows of the neighboring construction site, a flash of light erupted, an RPG streaking through the air with a hungry hiss. It struck the lead car, turning the street into a furnace of orange flame and twisted metal. Ifeoma gasped, her hand flying to her parted lips, but her gaze didn't waver. She saw Jae-hyun's car swerve through the fire, the door swinging open before the vehicle even fully stopped. She watched, frozen, as the brutal side of the man she loved was finally unveiled. Jae-hyun didn't hide. He didn't wait for his soldiers. He moved through the smoke like a wraith of vengeance. He caught the first White Tiger assassin by the throat. The sheer physical command of his posture overwhelming. The man before a blow was even struck. With a clinical, terrifying efficiency, Jae-hyun used his bare hands to dismantle the threat. There was no hesitation, no mercy, only the raw, ritualistic violence of a man protecting his territory. From 40 stories up, Ifeoma couldn't hear the wet thud of bone breaking or the screams, but she felt them. She saw him standing over a fallen rival, the amber streetlights catching the sharp lines of his jaw as he delivered a final, crushing blow. He looked up then, as if sensing her gaze through the glass, his face a mask of cold and yielding brutality. When he returned hours later, the scent of sandalwood had been replaced by the metallic, copper tang of blood. He stood in the doorway of the study, his black shirt torn, a jagged cut weeping over his cheekbone. He looked like a monster birthed from the asphalt of Seoul. Ifeoma stood her ground, her cornrows pulled back cleanly, emphasizing the sharp, regal discipline of her features. She looked at his hands, the tattoos, now stained with the literal lifeblood of his enemies. "This is the price," Jae-hyun said, his voice a jagged rasp. He didn't move toward her, sensing the line she was now forced to reevaluate. The White Tigers didn't just want the warehouse. They wanted to see if I was soft because of you. They wanted to see if the architect still had teeth. Ifeoma looked at the man who had whispered her name in the dark, and then looked at the killer standing in the light. She was fully aware that the line between protection and possession had blurred into something indistinguishable. The silence between them was heavy, pregnant with the realization that she was no longer an outsider looking in. She was part of the body count. "Can you live with it?" he asked, his narrow eyes fixed on her, signaling an obsession that would burn the city down just to keep her safe. "Can you love the man who did that?" Ifeoma felt the conflict clawing at her throat, the desire versus the restraint. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the silk of his sleeve, just above the bloodstains. She wasn't afraid of him, but she was terrified of the transformative power of this world. "I didn't fall for a businessman, Jae-hyun," she whispered, her voice a soft, steady chime. "I fell for the man who would do anything to keep the world from touching me. But if you become a monster, you have to promise to be my monster." The tension in his jaw shattered, and he pulled her into a possessive, breath-close embrace, his blood-stained hands marking the silk of her robe. They were standing at the edge of a violent catastrophe, and as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, Ifeoma realized she had made her choice. She would rather be the queen of a monster than the prey of his enemies. The golden silence of the Han estate was a lie Ifeoma had begun to believe. But lies have a way of rotting from the inside out. She was upstairs in Suin's sun-drenched bedroom, pretending to look at fabric swatches for a new project, while her heart remained anchored to floors below. In the dark mahogany shadows of Jae-hyun's study, the weight of the secret was a physical sin, a heavy cord tightening around her throat with every innocent laugh. Suin tossed her way. "I'll be right back," Suin said, jumping up with her characteristic, bubbly energy. "I left my tablet in Appa's study. He's at the docks today, so the coast is clear. If I don't grab my notes now, I'll forget everything for the gallery opening." Ifeoma froze, her fingers stilled against a scrap of indigo silk. "Suin, wait!" But the door had already clicked shut. Ifeoma stood, her regal composure fracturing as a cold, paralyzing dread washed over her. She remembered the night before, the heat, the surrender, and the way she had hurriedly dressed when a security alarm summoned Jae-hyun to the foyer. She had left her necklace on the side table, a distinct, custom-carved Nigerian coral piece that Suin had helped her pick out months ago. It was a one-of-a-kind mark of her heritage, and in that room, it was a smoking gun. By the time Ifeoma reached the ground floor, the air in the hallway felt like ice. The heavy doors to the study were wide open. Suin wasn't moving. She stood by the massive leather chair where Ifeoma had reclined just hours ago. The coral necklace dangling from her trembling fingers. The vibrant orange of the beads looked like drops of blood against the pale skin of Suin's palm. Suin, Ifeoma whispered, her voice a soft, desperate chime that died in the vastness of the room. Suin turned slowly. The girl Ifeoma knew, the bright, optimistic spirit who had been her first friend in an alien city, was gone. In her place was a woman whose world had just collapsed. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face a mask of shock that was rapidly curdling into a jagged, lethal fury. You said you were at the studio, Suin said, her voice a high, thin wire. You said you were working late on the brand identity, but my father's scent is all over this necklace. Your scent is all over this room. I wanted to tell you, Ifeoma began, stepping into the room, her hand reaching out in a gesture of mutual pull that was no longer there. It wasn't a plan. It was inevitable. Inevitable. Suin's laugh was a harsh, broken sound that echoed off the rows of leather-bound books. My father is a ghost. Ifeoma, he's a man who hides behind shadows and blood. And you were the only part of my life that was clean. The only part that was mine. She hurled the necklace at Ifeoma's feet. The coral clattered against the hardwood, the sound of a friendship shattering. How long? How many times did you look me in the eye while you were thinking about him? The confrontation was devastating. Ifeoma stood her ground, her cornrows pulled back with a discipline that now felt like a cage. She was fully aware of the line that had been crossed, the betrayal that could never be unmade. I love him, Suin. And he's obsessed with me. It's not a playful thing. It's dangerous for both of us. Love. Suin stepped closer, her narrowed eyes mirroring the sharp, angular intensity of her father. You don't love him. You love the power. You love the way he looks at you like you're his next conquest. And he doesn't love you, he owns you. Just like he owns the docks, and the warehouses, and the men he kills. The words were a physical blow, stripping away the romanticized veil Ifeoma had wrapped around her desire. She felt the conflict versus the restraint, the regal woman versus the girl standing at the edge of a catastrophe. Get out, Suin whispered, the words carrying the same cold, assertive authority as Jae-hyun. Take your things, take your love, but if I ever see you near him again, I'll make sure you remember why people are afraid of the Han name. I'm his daughter, Ifeoma. I have the same blood. As Ifeoma walked out of the estate, the blurred city skyline of Seoul felt like a distant, indifferent witness to her isolation. She had traded her only support system for the dark, intoxicating security of a monster. She was no longer a friend. She was a mistress of the underworld. And as she stepped into the humid night air, she realized that the price of her crown was the soul of the person she had loved most. The first fracture had become a canyon, and as she looked back at the darkened house, she knew there was no path back to the light. The silence of Ifeoma's studio was not broken by a scream, but by the clinical, terrifying sound of a door being breached with practiced silence. She had been standing by the window, her fingers tracing the jagged coral beads of the necklace Suin had hurled at her feet hours before, when the shadows of her room suddenly lunged. There was the sharp, synthetic scent of a sedative, a heavy hand spanning her throat to stifle her breath, and then the world and the glittering lights of Seoul vanished into a suffocating black hood. When Han Jae-hyun received the digital file, he was in the back of his sedan, his face a mask of angular, disciplined stone. The video was brief. Ifeoma, bound and reclining against a cold concrete wall, her regal cornrows disheveled, her strike gold eyes narrowed not in fear, but in a quiet, burning defiance. A voice, distorted and mocking, issued the ultimatum, the ancient docks by midnight, architect, or we see how long it takes for a queen to break. The explosion of violence that followed was not the frantic panic of a desperate man. It was the cold, ritualistic warpath of a man whose obsession had finally been weaponized against him. Jae-hyun didn't call the police. He called the shadows. Within 20 minutes, the Iron Boss had mobilized every asset he owned. The streets of Seoul became a hunting ground. He moved through the city like a force of nature. At a smoke-filled club in Mapo, Jae-hyun didn't ask questions. He shattered the jaw of a white tiger lieutenant with a single, assertive blow. His dark tattoos visible as his sleeves were pushed back in the heat of the interrogation. Where is she? he demanded, his voice a low, jagged rumble that made the men around him recoil. When the man hesitated, Jae-hyun's composure didn't break, it solidified into something far more terrifying. He reached for a pair of heavy industrial shears on a nearby table, his eyes fixed on the man's hand. I have spent 46 years building a world where no one touches what is mine, Jae-hyun whispered, his breath close proximity radiating a lethal heat. You have 5 seconds before I start removing the fingers you used to touch her. By the time he reached the Incheon docks, the architect had left a trail of broken glass and shattered bones across 3 districts. He stood under the towering cranes, his black shirt torn, the dragon's eye on his hand, stained with the literal lifeblood of those who had stood in his way. He didn't wait for his soldiers. He moved into the warehouse alone, his posture commanding, his narrowing eyes scanning the darkness until they found her. Ifeoma was there, center stage, under a harsh industrial light. Her emerald silk dress was ruined, but she sat with a discipline and self-respect that even captivity couldn't diminish. As Jae-hyun stepped into the light, the white tiger leader emerged from the shadows, a blade pressed against the rich, glowing brown of Ifeoma's neck. You came alone, the rival sneered. The great architect, brought to his knees by a foreigner. Jae-hyun didn't look at the man. He looked only at Ifeoma. His obsession was no longer a secret. It was a physical weight in the room, heavy and inevitable. I didn't come to negotiate, Jae-hyun said, his voice a flat, lethal chime. I came to show you why the dragon doesn't have a leash. In a blur of motion that defied his age and size, Jae-hyun bridged the gap. He didn't care about the blade. He cared only about the distance. He took the cut meant for her throat across his own forearm, his solid muscle absorbing the steel as he drove his fist into the rival's temple. It was a brutal, transformative display of power. BS. Vulnerability. He pulled Ifeoma into his chest even as he finished the man with a finality that silenced the warehouse. He held her then, his hands possessive and shaking, his blood marking the remains of her dress. Ifeoma leaned into him, her hand resting firmly on his lower back, signaling her emotional surrender to the monster who had saved her. She saw the true extent of his obsession, the way he looked at her as if she were the only living thing in a city of ghosts. I told you, she whispered, her voice a soft, steady chime against his frantic heart. I told you I wasn't afraid of the fire. Jae-hyun pulled back, his eyes searching hers, narrowed in a concentration that promised a love with devastating consequences. Then let the city burn, he rasped, as long as you are standing in the center of the flame with me. The air on the penthouse balcony was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of impending rain and the distant, electric hum of a city that had tried to break them and failed. Ifeoma stood at the edge of the glass railing, her silhouette a study in regal composure against the blurred neon tapestry of Seoul. She was no longer wearing the light, vulnerable cotton of her studio days or the emerald silk of her captivity. Tonight, she wore a structured gown of obsidian velvet, heavy and expensive, with a high collar that concealed the fading bruises on her throat. Her cornrows had been replaced by a crown of intricate braids adorned with gold wire, a deliberate fusion of her Nigerian heritage and the sharp, disciplined luxury of the world she now claimed. Her rich brown skin glowed under the ambient city light, not with the soft hope of a newcomer, but with the hard, polished luster of a woman who had walked through a furnace and emerged as tempered steel. Behind her, the sliding glass doors hummed open. She didn't need to turn to know it was him. The air always seemed to adjust its weight when Han Jae-hyun entered a room. He stepped onto the balcony, his tall, physically commanding frame filling the space beside her. He had traded the blood-stained rags of the docks for a tailored black suit that fit him like a second skin, hiding the fresh scars and the violent ink of his past. He leaned against the railing, his posture assertive but no longer restless. He didn't look at the skyline. His narrowed eyes were fixed on her profile, his concentration so absolute it felt like a physical touch. This was the obsession she had once feared, the power that had once threatened to consume her. Now, it was her foundation. The white tigers are gone, he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that carried the finality of a closing tune. The council has ratified the new borders. There is no one left to challenge what is mine. Ifeoma turned to him, her expression calm but charged. She reached out, her hand resting firmly on the back of his tattooed hand, her fingers tracing the dragon's eye. It was a gesture of mutual pull, of a woman who had stopped being a pawn and started being a player. "And Suin?" she asked, her voice a soft, steady chime. Jae-hyun's jaw tightened, the sharp lines of his face hardening for a fleeting second. "She has left for Europe. She says she cannot look at us without seeing the ghosts. But she is protected. She will always be protected." Protection is a beautiful word for a cage. "Jae-hyun," Ifeoma replied, her eyes locking onto his. "I know. I lived in yours for 2 years before I even knew the bars were there." Jae-hyun stepped closer, the space between them breath close. He reached out, his thumb brushing her lower lip with a rough gentleness that no longer made her flinch. "And now, do you still feel like a prisoner?" Ifeoma looked out at the city, the sprawling empire they now shared. She thought of the girl who had arrived from Lagos, with nothing but a portfolio and a desire for independence. That girl was dead, buried in the concrete of the ancient docks. The woman standing here was something dangerous and transformative. She had traded her quiet, moral life for a crown of thorns and a throne built on shadows. But for the first time in her life, she felt truly seen. "No," she whispered, leaning into his heat, her posture suggesting an emotional surrender that was born of choice, not weakness. "I don't feel like a prisoner. I feel like the architect." Jae-hyun's hands found her waist, large and possessive, pulling her flush against his solid, muscular build. He looked at her not as his daughter's friend, nor as a distraction, but as his equal in the dark. The love between them was forbidden, heavy, and carried a cost that would be paid in blood for years to come. But they were no longer standing at the edge of the cliff. They had jumped, and they had found that they could fly in the dark. "Then let them look," Jae-hyun said, his voice a dark promise against her ear as he watched the thousand witnessing eyes of the city lights. "Let them see the woman who survived the fire. Let them know that to touch you is to invite the end of the world." Ifeoma rested her head against his shoulder, her long lashed framing eyes that were focused and intense. She had traded her innocence for a reign, her safety for a monster, and her best friend for a king. As the first drops of rain began to fall, washing the dust of the old world away, she realized that this was her new reality. The rain had begun, and as she looked down at the city she now owned, she knew she would never look back. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Your feedback truly matters and helps shape future content. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.